So today we're going to be looking at Jesus calms the storm. So this is the second in the series of miracles that Jesus has performed. And this is one of my favourite miracles and one that I read to my kids often. There's so much packed into this short account. It's a miracle layered with richness and deepness, and there's so much to say to us 2,000 years later. Thanks, Steve. Firstly, though, notice how the account begins. Jesus and his disciples in the previous chapter have been through an extensive period of interaction. Jesus has been healing people of various diseases. Crowds have been following him to the point where he's constantly on the go. So much so that it says he doesn't have time to eat. He's had run-ins with religious leaders. He's been accused of breaking the Sabbath. His mother and his family finally catch up with him, and rather than supporting him, they accuse him of being out of his mind. It's fair to say that things have been a bit stormy. Things have already been a bit turbulent. So Jesus calls his disciples to come away with him by crossing to the other side. So when they cross over to the other side, there's a period of calmness until finally a storm arises. A storm that the passage says was furious, that broke over into the boat and that nearly swamped it. The disciples are distressed. They don't know what to do. And they look towards Jesus, who we're told is fast asleep, on a cushion in the stern. They wake him up. He gets up and rebukes the wind and waves, and peace is once again restored. This, however, leaves the disciples in an even more terrified state. After seeing this miracle, they question, who is this man that even the winds and the waves obey him? Now, I recently read this story to my children, Harry and Millie, and they asked me an important question. I can't remember who asked the question, but one of them. And they said to me, could Jesus not hear the storm going on? Is that why he didn't get up? I thought it was a really, really good question. So why doesn't Jesus just get up straight away once the storm begins? One of the key aspects of this account and this miracle is the fact that it displays for us the identity of Jesus. Now, the disciples' question at the end is actually answered within the account itself. And the answer to Harry and Millie's question also lies in the identity of Jesus. So what does it tell us about who he is? The account displays the two natures of Christ, his human nature and his divine nature. The quelling of the storm is, of course, a supreme example of his divine nature, that he has control over the natural world. By standing up and calming the storm, Jesus is declaring that he is Yahweh, he is God. As Psalm 135, 6-7 says, whatever the Lord pleases, he does in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all deeps. He is who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, who makes lightnings for the rain and brings forth the wind from his storehouses. The Jesus Storybook Bible that I read to the kids, which I would really recommend, is a great, great book, has a great way of explaining this miracle and Jesus' power. It says, the winds and the waves recognized his voice. It was the voice from the beginning. Jesus, the Son who brought all things into existence, as John's Gospel tells us, the commanding of the wind and the waves is a display of this divinity. Prior to this display of power, though, we're told that Jesus is asleep. This can, of course, point to his human nature. Jesus had just been on an extensive period of teaching, meeting people, interacting, and he was tired. And he needed rest. Jesus, though God, is a man, and as man, he got tired. In the boat, he's responding to his body's need for rest. There are times and periods for activity, and then there's time for rest, even for the Son of God. So, did Jesus hear the storm? Being the divine Son of God, he was most definitely aware of it, but he was also asleep. Being God, Jesus is sovereignly in control of all things. The storm that swells the boat that he occupies only does so because he allows it to. He can be at ease in the boat. He can sleep. He can be free of anxiety, worry, because he is in control. Nothing can take him by surprise. The very particles that make up the water that fills the rivers, lakes, oceans exist because he allows it to exist and because he sustains it. As the Apostle Paul says, he upholds creation. To take this even further, Jesus, his own death is not outside of his control. Death itself could not contain him. As Jesus says in John's Gospel, he says, I have the power to lay my life down, and I have the power to take it up again. Jesus can sleep easy because he can only be touched by what he allows to touch him. Jesus inhabits the world he created and is at complete ease because he's enfolded by his Father's love. The circumstances that he finds himself in does not determine his response. His Father's love determines his response, even when going through a storm. So what does this have to say to us? The revelation of Jesus' identity and his handling of the storm, both in the powerful command for the storm to cease, but also his contentment, his sleeping through the storm, his peace, has a lot to say to us. And it provides us with a way in which we can approach the storms in our lives. First thing to say here is that storms are inevitable. They're an inevitable part of life. There's no one here today who hasn't been through a storm in their life and who will not find themselves within one in the future. It's part of the human experience of living in this fallen world. We'll face challenges, trials, injustices, betrayals, and the spectre of death, disease, and illness loom large over us. Humanity is often driven by anxiety, fear, and worry. And we try to avoid storms in our lives. However, it's interesting that in this account, Jesus actually leads the disciples into a storm. He knew the storm was going to happen, but yet he told the disciples, "Come with me to the other side." Storms, though painful and frightening to go through, are often the means by which we grow. They're the means by which we're woken up from our slumber. They can be transformative, and they can actually make us see clearly. And I know this to be the case in my own life, so you may have heard me speak a bit about this before, but a few years ago, I went through a significant storm in my own life, a time of deep pain, and the result of strife, division, and discord within my family, and I was not coping well. I felt overwhelmed with pain, hurt, feelings of rejection. It was at that time that I also became a dad for the first time. I felt weary, tired, fearful, and stressed. So much so that what I was feeling internally became physical. My whole body was covered in eczema, and every night I would go to bed, I would fall asleep, next morning get up, and my pillow would be covered in blood, where I'd been scratching through the night. I remember being in the shower one day and just praying to God, when is this going to come to an end? Because it felt like it was going on forever. Now, in hindsight, when I look back to that time, I'm actually thankful for what I went through. At the time, I didn't feel thankful, but when I look back now, I am thankful because it taught me. It taught me to seek God and depend on him and to grow closer to him. It made me realize that there was stuff that needed to be done within me. It taught me the lesson of depending on his love and not be consumed or worried by other people's opinions, by the approval of family members, by being obsessed with trying to resolve something, obsessed with me trying to resolve the storm in my life. But I had to ultimately trust myself to him and realize that he was in control and that I wasn't. That his love is the foundation on which we all stand, not the love of others. It taught me to see Jesus for who he really is. As we come back to the passage, we realize the disciples had been blind as the storm raged. After it was still, they saw Jesus for who he was. See, the disciples are the ones that were really asleep on that boat. Jesus may have been physically asleep, and they were spiritually asleep. They don't realize who accompanies them in the boat, and this is the key to facing the storm, to realize who accompanies you when you are experiencing it or when you're within it. God is with you in all the storms you face in life. Jesus is right there beside us. And what makes this even more comforting is the fact that he actually chooses to do that. He doesn't need to do it. He chooses to do it. We don't worship a God who's remote, but we worship one that comes to us in the person of Jesus, who was actually thrown into the biggest storm there ever was to rescue me and you. When faced with death, Jesus went head first into the storm. He endured death in our place so that we don't need to endure the storm of judgment or punishment for our sins. He stood in front of that bullet that was headed for me and you. See, the philosophy of the world is that you face storms on your own or with others, but they too can be swept away by the storm. Remember, Jesus is in the boat with you. Christianity teaches we are never alone. He even says to us, I am with you always. Now, a common phrase throughout the Bible is, do not be afraid. And in a world dominated by fear, the Lord of the universe wants to remind you, do not be afraid. He continually says it throughout Scripture. Old Testament, New Testament. We don't need to be afraid because ultimately he's in control. The world might seem out of control to us, but it's important to realize the truth here, that the world is most definitely not under our control. The miracle emphasizes that he alone can silence storms. But even if the storm is at first not silenced, when you're made to experience it, you've got something to cling on to. You've got dependency on him. You need to trust in him. It also teaches us that we can have peace, and peace in the middle of the storm. We live in a world dominated by feelings. We often put our faith in our feelings. And this is exactly what the disciples did in the boat. Their circumstances were the driving factor for how they felt, if they felt okay or not. Jesus, however, presents to us a different way of approaching things. He calls us to have faith despite our circumstances, and this faith leads to peace. So what is peace? Dallas Willard defines it by saying this: peace is not the absence of conflict, it's shalom, or fullness of life. Peace is a rest of will that comes from divine assurance about how things will turn out. And Jesus says this in John's Gospel: peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. And elsewhere he says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. See, Jesus' peace is his own peace, and it's a peace that he promises to us. Jesus may not change your circumstance, but he will definitely change you, should you be willing to listen to him. His contentment, his non-anxious presence can be ours when we rest in him. Now, just something for all of us to think about. How many of you sitting here today have been anxious about the chair that you're sitting in? Maybe if it's a dodgy one or a squeaky one, maybe. But for the vast majority of people in here, I would say you've not even given it a second thought. But what you have been doing is silently and assuredly placing your faith in the chair to hold you up. You've trusted that it's going to do its job. Now, how does your faith, or my faith, in the chair compare to our faith in Jesus? Interesting one to think about. In the story, Jesus asks his disciples where their faith is. Do we have more faith in chairs than in Jesus? It's interesting, the disciples came a long way in their apprenticeship with Jesus. They journeyed with him for 3 years. They saw him do amazing things, but they often doubted, responded with little faith, were fearful or afraid. However, one day this all changed. It was when they encountered the risen Jesus. These men who had been scared for their lives on that boat and who were afraid of perishing, then went willingly to perish for Jesus. The disciples met some really gruesome ends. Most of them were murdered for their faith. This in itself is strong evidence for the truth of Jesus' resurrection. Something so significant must have happened to these men that their faith was literally transformed. They realized that death couldn't even touch them. And by extension, through faith in him, death and the storms of life, though they may experience them, they too would ultimately come out of them unscathed. This changed their approach to everything. So where do we go with our own lives? Let the story of Jesus calming the storm be the model for you and me. Let's begin to practice faith by placing it not in our circumstances, but in the one who controls all things. Realize who it is that's in the boat with us, traveling the seas of life. It's the creator of the universe, made man, who rides along us so that we're not alone. He's experienced the greatest tempest there ever was in our place on the cross. Storms of life will inevitably come. It may at times seem unrelenting, but find rest, shelter, and protection in the one who sleeps through it. Let this peace invade our hearts so that it calms us. The winds and the waves obeyed him when they heard his voice, and they fell silent. In the storms we endure, let's hear his voice and obey him. Be still and know that he is God. I think it's worship now. Thank you.